The document appeared in 2019, hidden inside the wall of a plantation house that was being demolished in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Construction workers discovered it wrapped tightly in oilcloth. The ink was faded, but the words could still be read. It was a letter written in 1831 by a white overseer named Edmund Hale to his brother in Charleston. The letter described something that frightened him so deeply that he never mailed it. Instead, he hid it where he believed no one would ever find it during his lifetime. "There is a Negro here," Hale wrote, "who knows things he should not know. He speaks of events before they occur. The slaves believe he carries the spirits of his ancestors in his blood. I have whipped him until my arm ached, and still he looks at me with eyes that seem to see through time itself. I fear this man, William. I fear him more than any living thing." According to plantation records matched with Hale's letter, the man was listed simply as Jim in the ledger, but that was not his real name. His true name was Jabari Mansa, and what was done to him represents one of the most intentionally erased stories in American history. Jabari did not resist slavery by running away or starting violent rebellion. He resisted in a way far more dangerous to the system that enslaved him. He refused to let them take his mind. What you are about to hear was buried for almost 200 years. Records were destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and the story itself was considered too dangerous to keep. But fragments survived. Court files, auction receipts, letters like Hale's that were hidden instead of burned, and testimony from formerly enslaved people recorded decades after emancipation by researchers who understood that spoken history often carried truths that official documents deliberately left out. When these fragments are placed together, they reveal something plantation owners in the 1800s understood but could never admit out loud. The most dangerous enslaved person was not the one who ran away or fought back, but the one who remembered. Jabari Mansa arrived in Charleston Harbor in August 1807, 1 month before the law banning the importation of enslaved people officially ended the legal Atlantic slave trade to the United States. The ship was the Henrietta Marie, a Portuguese vessel operating under Spanish registration to avoid British naval patrols. Records show that 312 Africans boarded the ship from the coast of present-day Senegal. Only 127 survived the crossing. The rest were thrown into the ocean, their bodies feeding sharks that learned to follow slave ships across the Atlantic like scavengers trailing an army. But this story does not begin there. It begins 37 years later, in 1844, in the woods outside Beaufort, when Jabari did something that would be examined by 3 separate court investigations and eventually lead to laws designed specifically to ensure no one could ever do it again. The incident involved 12 enslaved people from different plantations who met secretly on a Sunday night. What happened during that meeting depends on who tells the story. White authorities claimed it was a voodoo ritual meant to curse plantation owners. The enslaved community said it was a teaching, a moment where Jabari passed on knowledge that needed to survive. But everyone agreed on what happened afterward. 2 white men who discovered the gathering slowly lost their sanity. They began speaking languages they had never learned, describing places they had never visited, unable to separate their own memories from visions of events that had not yet happened. The courts labeled it hysteria. The enslaved people called it justice. When Jabari was questioned under torture about what he had done, he said only one thing: "I showed them what we remember, and memory is a weapon they cannot take." To understand what he meant, you must understand where Jabari came from and what he carried with him, something more dangerous than any blade or firearm. The Wolof Empire, in what is now Senegal, maintained an oral tradition stretching back hundreds of years. They had griots, master storytellers who memorized the full history of kingdoms, family bloodlines, and the wisdom passed down across generations. These men were not performers. They were living libraries. Their minds held information that would take years to write down. The Wolof deliberately kept this knowledge oral because written records could be destroyed or altered. Trained human memory proved stronger than any archive. Jabari's grandfather had been a griot. Not the highest rank, but respected enough that the family carried status. They were not royalty, but they were not farmers or laborers either. They belonged to that middle class of African society that European slave traders found most profitable, educated enough to be useful, but not powerful enough to be protected. When French and Portuguese traders built forts along the Senegalese coast, they paid local chiefs to deliver captives from this exact group, intelligent enough to exploit, isolated enough to sacrifice. Jabari was 17 when the raiders came. This was not a random village attack, it was business. The local chief, whose name history conveniently forgot, had signed a contract to deliver 50 young men to a Portuguese trader named Valentim da Silva. The contract specified ages between 15 and 25, healthy bodies, no visible disease. Payment came in textiles, rum and iron bars, the standard currency of the slave trade. The chief's men selected their targets with the precision of people filling a commercial order. Jabari was taken during the dry season, when young men traveled to coastal fishing villages to trade goods. 6 were captured with him, all from families with education or skills. The chief's men did not raid random villages. They took future leaders, teachers, administrators, merchants, people whose intelligence could be converted into labor value on American plantations. The holding facility near the coast was a stone fortress built specifically to process human cargo. It was not a prison in the traditional sense, it was a warehouse. Captives were chained in large rooms, fed barely enough to live, and kept alive just long enough to be shipped. During the 3 weeks Jabari spent there, he watched psychological destruction begin even before the physical journey started. Some captives collapsed into silence. Others attacked guards, even knowing it meant instant death. Most did what Jabari did. They observed, they memorized, they studied the system that had consumed them, searching for weaknesses. This was not heroism, it was survival. Warriors who did not study their enemies died quickly. During those weeks, Jabari met a man who changed how he understood resistance. The man was older, around 40, and had been a griot of much higher rank than Jabari's grandfather. His name was Boubacar. He had been sold deliberately by a rival political faction to erase his influence. Boubacar understood something Jabari had not fully realized yet. They were not only stealing bodies, they were trying to erase cultures, languages, entire civilizations of knowledge. Listen carefully, Boubacar whispered when guards were away. They will try to make you forget your name. They will take your language. They will beat you until you believe you are what they call you. But if you keep your memories, if you protect who you were before they took you, you carry something they cannot destroy. Memory is not weakness. Memory is the only weapon that survives every torture. This was not a speech about hope. Boubacar was practical. He was teaching a method. Jabari would need to memorize everything slavery tried to erase. His family lineage, the land of his homeland, stories his grandfather told, the taste of food, the sound of his mother's voice, the way dawn looked over the Senegal River. They will take your freedom, Boubacar said. They will take your body. But your mind remains yours until you surrender it. And if enough of us refuse to surrender, they cannot erase us. 3 days later, Boubacar died. The guards listed dysentery as the cause, but the captives knew better. His body stopped fighting, even though his mind stayed clear. Before he died, he made Jabari promise to remember everything. He recited his full lineage going back 7 generations. Jabari memorized every word. When the Henrietta Marie left the African coast with 312 captives, Jabari carried something the ship's captain would never understand. He carried genealogies of 2 Wolof families, oral histories of Senegalese kingdoms, and a system for preserving memory under conditions designed to destroy it. The Middle Passage was exactly what history describes. Jabari was chained for 11 weeks, movement so limited his muscles wasted away. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Henrik Costa, kept detailed logs. They survive today, cold and clinical. Numbers, death counts, water levels. What they do not record is what happened inside the minds of the chained. Jabari survived because he used Boubacar's method. As his body weakened, his mind grew stronger. He recited everything he knew. When his own memories were done, he recited Boubacar's. Then he began memorizing new things, faces, voices, daily routines, words spoken by the crew. This was not hope, it was discipline. Others noticed. A woman named Aminata asked why he whispered constantly. She understood immediately. She joined him. They shared memories, so if one died, the other would carry both. When the ship reached Charleston in August 1807, only 127 survived. Jabari was nearly too weak to sell, but after days of forced feeding and exercise, he was placed on the auction block at Ryan's Mart. He was examined like livestock, teeth checked, muscles squeezed. He was sold to a rice planter named Marcus Whitfield for $720. Plantation records listed him as Negro Jim. No known skills. What happened next began quietly, with a choice during his first week on the plantation. And this was only the beginning. He remembered the African who had always unsettled him, the one who learned faster than anyone else, the one who understood medicine without formal training, the one who somehow stood at the center of invisible social networks among the enslaved. Crawford ordered Jabari to be brought to the main house for questioning. What followed was later recorded in court documents because everyone present agreed something deeply disturbing had occurred. For 3 hours, Crawford, Jacob Reeves, and 2 other white witnesses attempted to force a confession. They used beatings, threats, psychological pressure. But Jabari's response never changed. He remained calm, almost observant, as if he were not the one being interrogated. When Crawford finally demanded to know who had written the forbidden documentation, Jabari lifted his eyes and looked directly at him, the same unflinching gaze that had disturbed overseers for decades. "I wrote nothing," he said, "but I remember everything." The room went silent. Jabari continued, his voice steady. "Every name, every beating, every child torn from a mother's arms, every woman violated, every man worked until his body failed. He said it all lived here, and he tapped his head. You can burn paper, you can destroy books, but you cannot destroy memory. And memory is a weapon you will never take from us." What terrified them wasn't defiance. They had dealt with defiance before. What terrified them was the implication. If Jabari truly carried years of detailed records inside his mind, then he was something far more dangerous than a document. He was a living archive. Jacob Reeves later wrote that the clarity of Jabari's recall suggested truth, not invention. If men like him existed, slavery faced a threat unlike rebellion, witnesses who could one day testify. Crawford's solution was not execution, it was removal. Killing Jabari might spread his influence further. So in 1832 he sold him again, this time to South Carolina. Jabari was already in his 40s, an age when most enslaved men were physically broken, but his intelligence made him valuable. The plantation he arrived at belonged to George Bellamy, a man obsessed with what he called scientific slave management. Bellamy believed control came not through cruelty but psychological manipulation. When he learned Jabari had been sold for being too intelligent, he was fascinated. Bellamy brought Jabari to the main house repeatedly, questioning him about African culture, resistance, and obedience. Jabari understood immediately, so he lied carefully. He fed Bellamy just enough truth to sound credible, while convincing him that African-born slaves lacked long-term planning ability, that proper routine erased resistance. Bellamy believed he was studying Jabari. In reality, Jabari was studying Bellamy. Meanwhile, within months, Jabari rebuilt his network among the enslaved, memory preservation, cultural transmission, living archives. But now he added something new, weaponized memory. He taught people not just to remember facts, but to describe trauma so vividly it forced listeners to feel it. Not exaggeration, emotional truth. In 1844, 12 enslaved people met with Jabari in the woods. They weren't performing rituals. They were practicing testimony, rehearsing how to tell the truth in ways that could not be ignored. When 2 white hunters discovered them, what they heard unsettled them deeply. Descriptions of separation, of ships, of pain so precise it made listeners physically ill. One of the men later began experiencing memories that were not his own. Doctors could not explain it. Investigations followed. No poison, no witchcraft, just the realization that vivid testimony could transmit trauma psychologically. The response was panic. New laws followed. Memory teaching was banned, gatherings restricted, intelligent enslaved people targeted for sale. Bellamy was expected to kill Jabari. He refused. Killing him would prove his power. Instead, he sold him again to isolate him. This final plantation was small, only 20 enslaved people, constant surveillance. Organizing resistance seemed impossible, so Jabari changed strategy. He taught something that required no meetings, No signals, no evidence. He taught witnessing. Alone at night, people learned to revisit trauma without being destroyed by it, to remember without losing themselves, to observe their suffering instead of drowning in it. Western psychology would not rediscover this for another century. The change terrified the owner. These people were still enslaved, but they were not broken. And something worse happened. The owner began dreaming their memories, feeling their pain. Within a year, he freed everyone and became an abolitionist. Jabari was freed in 1846. For the next 18 years, he taught literacy, memory, and testimony. He trained hundreds. When he died in 1864, nearly 300 people attended his funeral. They didn't mourn traditionally. They documented names, dates, families, evidence. White authorities panicked. Records were burned, reports buried, histories rewritten. Jabari's story was erased because it proved enslaved people had always been conscious witnesses, and memory, once distributed, could not be destroyed. That is why this story disappeared, and that is why it survived anyway.